Right, well, it's gone 8 o'clock, so let's make a start. Hello, welcome to everyone. So I'm Abigail Herron. I'm been invited by Green Springboard to share some of my experiences and thoughts about what's next in sustainability, especially against the backdrop of COVID. So just for GDPR purposes, we are recording this, so if you're not comfortable with that for any reason at all, don't leave, but feel free to turn off your video. And equally, if you've had a whole day of Zoom meetings and you have Zoom fatigue, I will not be offended in the least if I just see a static picture of you. We are a small but perfectly formed group this evening, so if you have questions at any point, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. There's also a chat feature on Zoom which we can use, and I know a couple of you have sent through questions already, so don't feel that you have to wait till the end, although I'll also give you opportunity at the end to ask any questions. Fantastic, I think that's all the housekeeping that we have, so let's crack on. So maybe you're wondering, who am I? So I head up the responsible investment team at Aviva Investors, which is the investment arm of Aviva, no surprises there. And that basically means I spend my days speaking to the companies that we invest in, and we invest about $500 billion globally across every industry. So I get to have some really good conversations with companies in all different sectors. So I'm going to try and speak to as many sectors as possible and be as broad as possible. So equally, if there's any sector you'd like me to focus in on, please speak up and I will tailor make that for that. And because I represent a large investor, I generally get really good access to the companies that, the senior management of the companies in question. And I get to ask some tricky questions around environmental, social and governance issues. So, I mean, it could be everything from A to Z. I could be talking to a pharmaceutical company about antibiotic resistance, through to Z. I could be talking to a cinema company about 0-hour contracts and labour standards. And almost everything in between. So I'm never bored. And the reason why Aviva employs myself and my team is because, and I'll touch upon this later, but we just don't want to see the companies that we're investing in on the front page of the newspaper for all the wrong reasons. A boohoo, for example, and everything that kind of kicked off over the summer with their labour standards. So at the other end of the scale, I also am a non-executive at a small startup myself, where we advise companies on the reputational risks that flow from sustainability issues in their business models and in the sectors that they operate in. So hopefully I can speak to both large and small this evening. So let me know if there's anything particular that you'd like me to focus on. So we're at the start of a decade of action. We've just got 10 very short years to cut emissions. So it's no surprise to see that before COVID, at least, the environment was starting to dominate the agenda in a way that we hadn't seen before. We're seeing the climate on the front pages of newspapers due to the Australian fires and various other reasons. Biodiversity was getting a lot more coverage, plastics as well, which we'll touch upon a little bit later. And then, of course, we had March. So COVID hit, everything changed, and everything is still in the process of being in flux. So what we're going to do is cover the impact that COVID has had on the sustainability agenda, on the actions, on the ambitions, and where sustainability could fit in a post-pandemic agenda. And again, this is just what I'm seeing from the coalface, talking to companies and to kind of thought leaders in the sustainability space. So just to share a few things that I'm detecting. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is, in a post-COVID environment, where does it leave the biggest brands? What have they done? Have they covered themselves in glory? Or will they be remembered for all the wrong reasons? And there's one website that we really like. It's run by an NGO, and it's called simply Did They Help? So didtheyhelp.com. And you can basically put in any large company or well-known celebrity or business person, and you can see what action did they take against the backdrop of COVID. And the thinking is that everything that's flowed from March has been completely unprecedented, and everybody's been kind of caught on the hop, and so this website was looking to capture basically the responses just in one place, because there's not a one-stop shop for how companies responded 10 years ago during the financial crisis, and they wanted to sort of remedy that. And I think it's really interesting because they also rank companies, who's done really well, and specifically why have they done really well on COVID, and then other companies that maybe have strayed into the kind of unhelpful territory or have used social media to maybe cast doubt over if COVID is real and all these sorts of things. So the website, I've just found the chat function. Thanks, Claire. So it's called Did They Help? And it's didtheyhelp.com. And it's free. It's open source. Oops. Right. And so I think if you want a bit of inspiration, there's some really good stories there. There's some examples of ingenuity, lots of energy. I think I do hate to say Unilever is a good example of sustainability because it's such a lazy option. Everyone always says Unilever, but they did cover themselves in glory, which has been captured in this website. Timpsons as well in the UK have done some really good things there in terms of helping out for kind of locksmiths and just things that you would expect to kind of fall by the wayside against the kind of key worker issue. But it's not just, did they help or how did they respond? I think what we've seen from COVID is quite an interesting opening up of the discussion around things like air pollution. So it's been a problem for a long time. Every now and then you see news reports on cities in the EU that are not meeting air quality levels, but it's never really got so much traction as an issue. Whereas COVID has kind of really brought it into the spotlight, and people have seen there's a noticeable difference in air quality. And I mean, my personal view is we're seeing a lot better technology in terms of personal devices that help monitor air pollution. I worked out in China a couple of summers ago with the Bank of China and the Bank of England on a climate change tour, and I was given a lot of these devices that told me, what was the particulate level and should I be wearing a mask? And in Beijing, a lot of the time the answer was yes, you should be wearing a mask. And I just think it's only a matter of time before we get this sort of technology at a small enough scale that we can get it in our phones. And then if everybody can tell in a real-time basis what their pollution level is like, I think that's when the conversation will really start to be taken up to policymakers, and we'll see a lot more hopefully a lot more action on that if people have the ability to say, wow, I'm in a really bad pollution area at the moment. The other issue that wasn't at all being discussed and now is from from COVID is antibiotic resistance. So massive issue, but I think it's fair to say it's been on the fringes for a while. But when we look at the UK figures, for example, over half of the deaths in the UK have been from secondary bacterial infections rather than pure COVID. And those bacterial infections are the ones that antibiotics couldn't remedy. So I personally have seen a lot more discussion around public health, but also the role of antibiotics in tackling COVID issues. And then, so obviously we can't have a chat about sustainability without the big one, climate change. We're seeing tipping points. We're seeing tipping points sooner than we had predicted. In some cases, we're seeing them decades sooner than we had predicted. And we're seeing, the rapid loss of Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets, large-scale coral reef die-offs, increasing wildfires in the Pacific Northwest at the moment. And some of you may have seen the David Attenborough documentary this week about biodiversity loss and the sort of sixth age of extinction that we're finding ourselves in. And I don't think climate change has ever got so much coverage in the media, which is helpful and not entirely unexpected. But the kind of context for a lot of these articles, at least the good quality ones, is that we've only got X amount of time left. Some people are saying 10 years. Some people are also saying 10 years for the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll get to in a little bit. But we're definitely seeing a much increased frequency of extreme weather events. I often talk to the actuaries at Aviva about this, and their models just don't capture the reality of what's happening as an actuarial profession. But we're getting a growing body of data about the impacts. But I guess the big question is, are companies, from the smallest companies to the largest companies, are they prepared for mitigation and adaptation? And are they really getting serious about the impact of climate risk on their business? We've got coming up, not this November as planned, but next November, the 26th Conference of Parties on Climate Change in Glasgow. So at least in the UK, I definitely don't see climate change going anywhere. It's only going to be more and more in the spotlight. And I suppose one of the things that I've been thinking about is, what does this mean for businesses on a day-to-day level? And I'm very happy to answer any questions about that as well. So one big change that I've seen that I wanted to touch on very briefly is sustainable finance. So, I've been working in sustainable finance for 15 years now, and it was a really hard slog in the beginning. Nobody knew really what kind of ethical investment was, or sustainable investment, or why it was important. But the last 18 months has really seen it taken off. And, if you've been plugging away at it for such a long time, it's very satisfying to see. But the reason I raise this as an issue that's a big trend that we're seeing at the moment is the impact on what it means for you as an individual, for you if you're offering stakeholder pensions, for example, to your staff as you grow your businesses. And also, what does it mean for you if and when you get to the stage that you want to attract external finance? And we've got a webinar on Thursday evening that goes really deep into that. So this is kind of a little taster now. And then if you've got any more questions, either feel free to chime in, or please feel free to come along to the webinar on Thursday evening as well. So we're seeing just a huge amount of regulation and interest from policymakers all across the EU, in the UK as well, just pushing sustainable finance, because when you talk about pensions, it's not that interesting. I completely understand why people's eyes glaze over when you talk about your pension, but also the average man or woman on the street is making the connection between what's in my pension and what the things that I care about, or what are the things that my business is pushing versus what's invested in my pension. So, if you've got a startup that's in, let's say, sustainable textiles, and then, your pension fund is invested in Boohoo or Associated British Foods, which is Primark, or just companies that don't quite speak to the ethos of your startup, then I feel like there's a lot more scrutiny on that at the moment. And one of the reasons that sustainable finance is kind of trending and growing exponentially is the impact of such companies for failing to manage the environmental, social and governance risks. So we had Rio Tinto in the headlines last week. They basically blew up a World Heritage Site that was, I think, 46,000 years old, very much revered by the indigenous people in Western Australia. And fast forward 4 or 5 weeks, the chief executive has fallen on his sword and resigned off the back of that decision. And we've seen a massive drop in the share price. I've mentioned it before, but Boohoo was kind of the corporate failure in terms of sustainability of our summer, with their terrible labour conditions. Ted Baker, I guess 18 months or so before, with their sort of inappropriate management behaviour. And then, you got the classic example of BP, which I can't believe was 10 years ago, but Deepwater Horizon and everything that flowed from that in terms of share price decline, reputational risk and all those sorts of things. So this is a slide that you may have seen before, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They're the updated version of the Millennium Development Goals, and it's basically a framework for everybody in our world to kind of galvanise their actions and their ambitions around. So we've got 16 different issues, and then the 17th Sustainable Development Goal is building partnerships to help further the goal. And I think as a trend, this is not going anywhere, especially because they've been around for 5 years now. They're not really, just COVID has really delayed some of the implementation of the different sustainable development goals. It was going okay until, obviously until March, but even in January of this year, there was a lot of positive talk about the kind of groundswell of interest and action around it, and just hanging different initiatives off it. But last week we saw the Social Progress Index reporting that the progress on all these different sustainability issues has been delayed by 62 years because of COVID. Now, I mean, I've not checked their methodology, but they are a credible think tank. I mean, it sounds a bit kind of finger in the air, but you can well understand why everybody's priority has shifted to sort of firefighting mode. So it'd be interesting to see the next 10 years and how this plays out. But in terms of trends, these are the ones that are galvanizing policymaker and company action. So, these are the ones that are not going away. I've also seen, in terms of where the money's flowing, for example, lots of money's been flowing into battery technology. So the think tank was called the 2020 Social Progress Index, and it's based in Washington. It's a sustainability and social issues think tank, and they've been around, I guess, about 20 years. And I can make sure that you, I can share the link to the study if that's helpful as well. So thanks for that question. Yeah, so where's the money going in terms of making the most of these trends? The last 6 months has seen most of just an absolute enormous amount of sustainability focus and money going into battery technology, so electric vehicles and that sort of thing. About 40% of all the money spent in and around the sustainable investment world has been on that. We've also seen things like the community, so in the retail space, the focus has been on the provenance of food. So we've had the largest listing ever in the US, which was a plant-based burger, just absolutely off the scale of where, you know, everyone just wanted a piece of it, from Goldman Sachs through to obscure Cayman Island domiciled hedge funds. Everybody wanted a piece of a vegan burger, which, you know, if you'd have told me that 10 years ago, I would have fallen off my chair. But it's been followed as well by plant-based milk. Everyone wants a piece of that action as well. So it's interesting to see what's attracting, you know, what are the sexy topics in food, in retail, and where's the money going? And then finally, because there's so many different issues that we could talk about, but the two that I think have gone from fringe to mainstream over the last 2 years is biodiversity, specifically biodiversity loss, and plastics. COVID has very much put the spotlight on the impact of biodiversity loss and, you know, what is the next pandemic. And there's been all sorts of discussion about habitat loss and how that brings new novel viruses into contact with humans and everything that flows from that. Plastics, it's been said many times, but the documentary Blue Planet 2, David Attenborough's documentary, really was a turning point for plastics. And I don't open my inbox at all without seeing 2 or 3 emails from companies that are working on new novel ways to reduce plastics. So I think that's a massive trend. So one company that's really caught my attention recently uses ghost fishing, which is abandoned fishing nets that are still floating around in the sea indiscriminately killing fish. And they grab these and they turn them into carpets and mattresses. And they've just listed on the Italian stock exchange because everybody wants a piece of that action. So that's one that I've been watching closely the last couple of weeks. And just to round this off in the interest of time, there's seems to be a big increased emphasis on producer responsibility. So who's doing what? Why are they doing it? You know, is it greenwash, or are they genuinely integrating it across their supply chains and into their business strategy? So there's, you know, trends. It's an awful lot of things that we could have talked about. So I tried my best to kind of touch on a few that might spark interest. I hope you found this interesting. As I mentioned, we've got a deeper dive on Thursday evening into where the money's flowing and what investors expect from companies about this. Would anyone like to either ask any questions or use the chat function? I've got a couple of questions actually that have come in via email. Let's have a look. Oh, this is a good one. So in terms of sustainability trends, what do you see as a fad? So I guess turning the webinar on its head. So I guess in the fashion sector, I see some companies are putting out collections that are just a few items that speak to sustainability, whereas the rest of their stock is still doing things the old-fashioned way and the non-sustainable way. So I guess I see that as a fad, because unless it's fully integrated across, everything they do, it could be kind of just an isolated thing. And also biodegradability. So we've seen everything from cat litter to biodegradable nappies. And on the face of it, that's a great sustainability win. But also, we just don't in the UK have the waste set up to allow these things to biodegrade. So it's kind of a waste of time, really. So I think that is a fad that will be uncovered. And we've got a message from Helen here. Thanks, Helen. So Helen's asking, in terms of governance, how do you ensure companies are delivering to the standards they say they are, for example, ISO? That's a really good question, Helen. And it takes up a lot of the time of my team. So I've got 14 analysts, and we also buy in external research to check that, if a company says X, they're actually delivering X. It's a bit of a dark art. A lot of it we have to take at face value because we invest in so many different companies. If they say 45% of our fisheries catch are, certified to MSC, Sustainable Fisheries Standards, we just don't really have the ability to kind of check that. So one way we try and get around that in terms of good governance is asking for the sustainability report to be audited. So in the same way that you wouldn't accept a balance sheet that hadn't been audited from a large company, then I don't really see why you should accept sustainability claims that haven't been audited. A few years back, it was Porsche, I think, they said in their sustainability report that their carbon emissions were 4 times that of the entire planet. Now, obviously, fat finger error or some sort of miscalculation or typo, but just the fact that that got through is quite worrying. So I think auditing is a way around finding out, who's doing what. We've just had a question from Charlotte as well, asking, is there any knowledge on reusable products and any advice for a startup company? Well, I would say this, wouldn't I? But Green Springboard's got a brilliant microsite where it saves you hours of time looking for suppliers. And I've definitely seen some reusable product suppliers on there. So I guess that would be my advice for your first stop, and just see if you can kind of narrow it down using the Green Springboard sort of approved companies. And then, Claire, you've asked me a question as well. Sorry, not doing these in order. So Claire's asked, what are the gaps that you've seen? Any sectors or issues that aren't being addressed by business fast enough? That's a good one. So, let me see. I think probably textiles and fashion is quite behind the curve. Until recently, I would say just all the issues around biodiversity were not really getting much traction, because I guess it's harder to make the case for biodiversity. You can't kind of lift and shift the thinking behind climate change and apply it to biodiversity loss, even though things are really not good at all in that space. But then the last 6 months has seen quite a focus on that. So I'm cautiously optimistic that that's a gap that's looking to be plugged. And issues that aren't being addressed by businesses. Well, labour standards have taken a hit in the last 6 months. I think some issues have kind of fallen off the radar as well. So I guess there's only so much bandwidth that you can have, but it's tricky to kind of keep people's focus on an issue that's been around for a while. So like palm oil, it feels like a perennial issue, but also I feel like there's still a massive gap to be filled there. Well, unless there's any other questions, I realise that we've run over quite a lot. So just to say thank you everyone for dialing in. There's the webinar on Thursday that I mentioned. There's also Green Springboard's website for recommendations about courses, about suppliers, and how to grow your green business. So please check, and they're wonderful resources. And yeah, thank you everyone. Good evening.